So hello, everyone, and welcome from wherever you are signing in today. Thank you for joining us for AIrish, Exploring Irish Theater and Artificial Intelligence. My name is Julia Nelson. I'm the Program Manager for Irish Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, a program that aims to deepen relations with Ireland through events and initiatives around research, culture, diplomacy, and innovation. Today's conversation weaves together a number of these strands, offering a new look at the evolution of Irish drama through the lens of digital technology. I'm delighted to introduce the leader of the AIrish project and director of the Irish Studies program, Catherine Flynn. Catherine is associate professor in the UC Berkeley Department of English, where she specializes in British and Irish modernist literature in a European avant-garde context. Her book, James Joyce and the Matter of Paris, was published with Cambridge University Press in 2019. She has also written on Flann O'Brien, Walter Benjamin, Bertolt Brecht, and Surrealism. And she's currently at work on the Cambridge Centenary edition of Ulysses, forthcoming in 2022, and a volume titled New Joyce Studies, 21st Century Critical Revisions. As we'll learn today, her new AIrish project was piloted this semester as an undergraduate seminar, combining the tools of machine learning and literary criticism to analyze dramatic works that span 250 years. Joining Professor Flynn to discuss the project is director and playwright Peter Glazer. Peter's plays, adaptations, and collaborations include Woody Guthrie's American Song, based on the songs and writings of the American folk singer, O'Carolan's Farewell to Music with Celtic harpist Patrick Ball, Heart of Spain, a musical of the Spanish Civil War, and Foe, adapted from the novel by J.M. Coetzee. Among his current projects are a new play with Patrick Ball, Come Dance With Me in Ireland, based on the poetry of William Butler Yeats, and a stage adaptation of Karen Shepard's historical novel, The Celestials, which is currently in development at the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art. Peter has been teaching in the Department of Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies at UC Berkeley since 2001. Professors Glazer and Flynn will speak to us today about the intersections of literature, technology, and performance, considering how artificial intelligence both expands and challenges our understanding of individual subjectivity and artistic expression. After the discussion, there'll be time for Q&A, so please post any questions you might have in the chat. And finally, before we begin, I just want to say a word of thanks to the Irish Consulate of San Francisco and to the Irish government's Immigrant Support Program for their generous support of AIrish. I'll now turn it over to Peter Glazer to start the discussion.
Thank you so much, Julia, and welcome everyone. A real pleasure to be part of this conversation. I want to thank Catherine for introducing me to this remarkable project that she's working on, and also Julia Fawcett, one of my colleagues, who introduced me to Catherine. So on behalf of my work, it's great to be part of this conversation. Machine learning and literary criticism are the terms in play here. And I wanted to give a couple of caveats. You got a sense of the kind of work that I do. I am neither an expert on AI or computational analysis, or really, for that matter, Irish drama, though I know a lot more about the latter than the former. I have spent a lot of time in Ireland, I will say, and have worked on a number of projects about Ireland and Irish literature. I am a playwright and a director and a scholar of theater and performance. So I come into this conversation with what you might call a knee-jerk humanist bias, which has already been tested by some of the amazing work Catherine has shared with me. As she wrote in her notes, dude, I'm a humanist too. So we're on the same page. And I know that there are ongoing conversations like this one taking place here at Cal, around the country, around the world, about using computational analysis as a resource in humanities research and also in creative work. I've been privy to and on the edges of some of those conversations, but I'm excited to be more in the center of those conversations now. And one of my colleagues, Lisa Wymore, has been working on those intersections in her own work as a choreographer, but also on some university discussions around those subjects. So I think the first thing to do for lots of you is just for Catherine to talk a little bit about what AIrish is, and then we can get into some of the questions that I mean, I was introduced to this subject about a month ago and have some questions that we can open up for conversation. But Catherine, do you want to tell us a little bit about the project?
Sure. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. It's so nice to see your faces, and I'm looking forward to more conversations coming out of this. I'm delighted to see some of the students from the course are also with us, and we'll be showing some of their work and talking with them as well. So AIrish started, it's a research project that is in some ways prompted by the desire to develop a critical and pedagogically inventive application of digital methods that relates to the focus of the Irish Studies program. So we're developing Irish Studies at Berkeley as a nexus of different communities, faculty at UC Berkeley, Irish and Irish American people in the Bay Area and in Ireland and further afield. And one of the key communities in that population are computer scientists, people developing technology. And so this course is a way, it also intersects with, contemporary movements in literary analysis, but in a way, a very controversial one, the application of digital methods to studying literary texts. So this course attempts to be critical in thinking about what we can and can't do with it and how it augments, let's just call them traditional methods of thinking about drama, which involve reading it closely, reading it aloud, interpreting it together in groups, thinking about its historical and its literary context. And so AIrish is a kind of blend in a way, or a kind of complementary bringing together of different methods. And so we used computational analyses to enhance our discussion of a trans-historical syllabus of Irish texts. So starting in the 18th century with Richard Brinsley Sheridan and running up to the 21st century with Enda Walsh's The Walworth Farce. And so we used analyses of a bunch of different factors, things like word count, word frequency, speech length, play length, etc. And we also used an AI text generator to generate new scenes. And this text generator was trained on a corpus, a fairly large corpus of every Irish play we could get our hands on. And the AI text generator was trained on that and was able to produce new scenes, just given a couple of prompts, like a couple of character names, a couple of opening lines, and then it would produce dialogue. So those strange new AI generated scenes were very interesting. They were very funny. They were often poignant, which was also funny. And they formed a very interesting foil to the actual plays on the syllabus, and allowed us to talk about themes that had emerged in the course to do with borrowed words, stolen words, mimicry, memory, artificiality, and kind of synthetic language. So over the course of this syllabus, we talked about the construction of Irishness and the kinds of language that were used or invented to present Irishness. And so the text generator offered us a very interesting kind of amalgamation of those different languages that we could sort of bring into comparison with plays on the syllabus. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. It's this was a course that I taught this spring, so we just finished, and it was the first course, and so it's a first run through using the corpus, rendering the corpus useful for a counting algorithm, and also something that the text generator would be trained on, and so this is a kind of learning experience as well, and it had suggested all kinds of possibilities for the future.
Great, thank you. And having read the syllabus and looked at some of the data that this process generated, I feel like I really now need to take this class, because then I would really understand exactly what the stakes are. So one of the, as a theater practitioner and someone who also teaches theory, and I also teach on the American avant-garde, one of the first questions that came to mind, or one of the first things that rose up for me, was how would this process, this form of computer analysis, address different kinds of texts, right? So, and this is something Catherine and I have talked about. So, you know, I wonder if traditional forms of of script analysis function if you're looking at, for example, plays by Heiner Mueller or plays by Beckett or plays that are not following more conventional structures, narrative structures, and so on. So one of the questions that came to mind is, and it may be fairly obvious, but just to put it out there, what can computational analysis teach us about Irish drama or drama in general? I mean, the Irish being the model we're using, but theoretically, if this idea works, it could be applied to other national literatures. And that would not be possible or practical within more conventional forms of research. What does this mass amount of data that can be analyzed give us the ability to do that we would not be able to do in a practical sense in a library or through a reading process? And then the other side of that is, how might this process risk flattening out or sort of closing down certain kinds of information that these plays offer to readers, right? And Catherine, do you want to take that right there? Because that's sort of the big framing question, I think, and then we look at a lot of the details that might be raised along those lines.
Yeah, absolutely, Peter. I mean, you raise very interesting and important points. I mean, I think that there are two areas to consider. One is the issue of method, and the other is the issue of principle. And that principle, I think, could be, include questions of the contemporary use of data mining and surveillance. And so what does this mean for us as a society, that these kinds of digital methods are being trained on us? And what does that mean about how we understand ourselves, or how can we respond to them? And we can object to them. We can sort of draw legal fences around ourselves, but how do we relate to them, or is there a way of understanding them that this can generate or lead to? And I'd be very interested in talking about that a bit later. So the first is the issues of method. And I think that digital humanities methods have often been greeted with resistance on the part of scholars in the humanities. And I think understandably because of a bunch of reasons. I mean, some of it is to do with institutional resources. This idea that data studies could just replace humanistic inquiry. You get tangible results. You can, hire a team. It can have sort of a research agenda that looks like a scientific research agenda, and that can be very appealing from a funding point of view. And so that's quite threatening. And there was a certain kind of conversation, a while ago about replacing close reading, which is the kind of where humanistic inquiry really lives, like looking at, word order, word choice, imagery, rhetorical phrases and twists, the very kind of stuff of literature at the kind of fine grain. And there was an idea of replacing that close reading with distant reading, what was called distant reading, which would be, we kind of plug this play or this novel into some kind of algorithm, and that will give us our answers. And so clearly that latter is a kind of, I'm in a way simplifying it and making it sound naive, but there are ways in which it can be naive, or it can be blind to the nuances of text. And so there is a kind of fallacy that everything can be analyzed by a computer. And that obviously is not the case. And so there's a kind of smaller version of that fallacy, which is what I might call the kind of fallacy of the predominant, where, say, the most common word in a play is the most important word, the play that appears most often, bracketing out obvious words like the or a or whatever. But often it's the word that's said only once in a play that's the most important. And especially in a play, it's how it's said, what the staging is, how the word is interpreted by the particular actor embodying the script in that moment in time, and the kind of historical context in which the play is written and in which the play is performed. So that, this single word might be far more important than a bunch of other words that are far more common. However, those very common words can actually give us the context against which that uniquely important word takes on its force, becomes really operative. And so this is really an example of what I mean by using these two approaches in tandem, using one to augment the other. And so just using data analysis would really flatten everything out. I mean, it would just be, in a way, ludicrous. But there is a way that this can actually show us, give us practical ways of analyzing drama. So we could think about the evolution of, say, sentence length over the history of Irish drama, or the evolution of scene length. Is there a pattern? Is there some kind of development? Are there moments when speeches become longer or shorter? And how could we think about that in a larger historical and political context? And so we're just kind of starting to think about that, but it really opens up interesting questions. And there's something else I want to say about this. Avant-garde. So there are a lot of plays that, or there are some plays that forego narrative, as you were saying, forego even sentences, and start to, present just words. And how could some kind of counting algorithm deal with that? I would say that it could help us actually grapple with this, because as readers, we're usually we've trained ourselves to look for character, to look for narrative. And if those are really missing in an avant-garde text, in an avant-garde play, we're kind of at a loss. And so some kind of quantitative algorithm might actually allow us to get some kind of foothold into a play by helping us to start to see patterns. So it can tell us what, all of these algorithms can tell us what very well, but then the next step is to say, well, what does that mean? What to interpret. And clearly what will be counted is dependent on what we actually set up to be counted at the beginning. So a lot of this is about learning how to use this methodology, learning how to train it on the right objects, and get it to, say, observe the most interesting phenomena, the things that will reveal the most to us, given the questions that we want to bring to a set of texts.
Yeah, that's great. And there's some great questions coming up in the chat as well. A few responses. In a way, one could say that it's not about close reading and distant reading. It's about two different kinds of close reading. The kind of reading that a computer does is close in a way that the human mind doesn't necessarily think, like how many times does that word occur on a page, right? We're following narrative. That's the way that we're trained, or we're following characters. So it's a couple of different kinds of analysis. But there's so many interesting things in this. I mean, this conversation could go on for a very long time. So I think one of the key things, and I posted this in the chat that you mentioned, Catherine, is what are we asking the computer to ask of the texts, right? Because so there's that, and then and those questions come from the researcher who is looking for certain kinds of answers, right? And so, length of speech is an interesting one. And then for me, I would say, and who is getting the long speeches as drama continues? Is it men? Is it women? Is it the principal character? Is it a secondary character, right? Those are interesting things to play with. Another way that this feels really interesting to me is to isolate particular playwrights, like to look at the career of a particular playwright and see how their work evolved over time. And were they involving different kinds of characters at different times, or were their ways of expressing themselves through text changing, right, as time went on? So go ahead, Catherine.
So let me just show you then. Let me show you
Sure.
what we did this semester, and then we can talk about ideas for what could happen in a further iteration of the course. So let me do a quick screen share. And okay, so this is the, tell me now how well you can see this. So on the left, is it too small to read? It's too small, I think.
It's okay for me, but I'm not sure about other people.
Yeah, so on the left, this is the list of plays. these are the playwrights here at the second column. And I've organized these according to date. So our syllabus began with Richard Brinsley Sheridan's School for Scandal. And we went up to, so Enda Walsh's, there's some that are just undated, so that's why they're at the bottom. But Enda Walsh at the bottom. And so what we see across the top here are genres. So these were inputted by my team of research assistants, comedy, tragedy. These are very kind of general terms, and these could be refined. So this could open up a really interesting avenue of exploration where we have more specific genres of theater that we then examine according to these criteria. So that's just a tag that the computer used. So this is our source. We got a lot of them from Gutenberg because it standardizes the format, and that makes it easier for the algorithm to work on it. So then we have average sentence length. So 12 words, 13 words, 14 words, average speech length, average scene length, average act, and then the number of characters. This is interesting. And then the number of speeches by characters, as well as the number of words by character. So this, as you were suggesting, Peter, offered some very interesting insights. So there were some plays, like for example, Brian Field's Translation, where a seemingly minor character actually said as much as a major character. So Manus, the son of the headmaster, says a lot. Like he's actually speaking most of the time, or he says the most. Whereas his father, the headmaster, has long speeches, like more infrequent long speeches. And so looking at these numbers can be surprising, and it can also reinforce an idea that we have approaching the play, that the headmaster is a kind of gifted speech maker. You know, he's a rhetorician, whereas Manus, his son, is someone who is filling in, he's connecting everyone, he's doing the sort of the work of transmission. And
can I add something to that?
Yeah.
It also, I think that very question becomes revealing, because the character who speaks the most is the one the playwright has chosen to give the most.
Yeah.
It's sort of, that's where the playwright is investing a lot of their time, right? Doesn't necessarily mean that they're saying the most important things, but they're being given more stage time, if you will, which says something about the playwright's intentions in the storytelling or in the purpose of that play, right?
Yeah, it really does. Yeah, it really does. So yeah, I mean, it's often the the number of speeches per character can reinforce the kind of running order in the list of protagonists in the play, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes there are surprises, and sometimes a character who seems very important is way down the list. That doesn't mean that they're not important, though. So, for example, Waiting for Godot, Samuel Beckett's famous play. Let's have a look at it.
60s, 50s, excuse me.
Yeah.
There we go. Right up there, 209.
Oh yeah, there it is. Yes. So obviously Lucky only has 9 speeches, but the play wouldn't be itself without him. Yeah, so this, I think, this is the first kind of version of analyzing, but another version could look at syntax, for example. It could look at how sentences become increasingly complex or less complex as time goes on, and within particular subgenres of drama. But it could also track particular phrases. It could track them across the corpus, like across the Irish drama corpus, or it could track them laterally into various different kind of, let's just say, discursive formations like newspapers, novels, political speeches. So when we were looking at The Plough and the Stars, Sean O'Casey's play, we read an article about how he reuses lines from speeches by Padraig Pearse. and he tweaks them slightly. And you need a kind of human being, I think, to look at the kind of details of how O'Casey reshaped the lines. He largely imported them, but he heightened them. He made them more stark and more extreme. But what an approach like this could do is just discover where language comes from, where playwrights are drawing from, either consciously or unconsciously, actually. And so that is a kind of a very interesting research tool. Yeah, so there are other applications. Like one could be, connected with your idea of subgenres of drama. Can this tell the difference between a comedy and a tragedy?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's very interesting work done in computational literary analysis. And so one essay was a study of volume in the novel, and it trained the algorithm to count words to do with speaking. So whispering, saying, shouting, exclaiming. And then it was able to track how loudly people spoke over the course of a set of novels. That's really fascinating. And so you can imagine identifying a set of terms to do with sorrow and joy. And they could be, this is just one like quick idea right now off the top of my head, but you could then train an algorithm to look for those in a corpus and to see in some ways how those terms appear, how terms of joy might appear in a tragedy actually, and when, and the inverse. So that it's really the kind of, I think using these methods turns out not to necessitate a flattening out of kind of complexity and nuance and sort of an interest in subjectivity, but rather it calls for a kind of increase of ingenuity on our part. How do we use these tools? How do we use them meaningfully? And what do we want to investigate with them?
Yeah, very exactly. And sort of understanding what the algorithms can do and how we can train them to, with that knowledge, figure out how we want to go about this process. One of the things you raised is the idea of whispering or loudly, and as a director, I teach script analysis, and I also teach students how to read a play, and then I also teach students how to stage a play. The role of stage directions is something that feels like there's a whole possible set of inquiries that could be done around that as well, because dialogue is not the only thing that plays do.
Yeah.
And I don't know what those questions would be, but
yeah.
For example, the first 5 minutes of Endgame, there's no dialogue.
Yeah.
It is simply Clove moving around a room, doing various things and occasionally laughing, but it doesn't come across as dialogue. So, and Shaw, of course, is known for his endless stage directions and notes about the characters. So I'm just pointing out that that's another place. One could do a computational analysis of different playwrights. Some playwrights have no stage directions whatsoever, and some have a lot. And that's also talking about sort of the interest of the playwright in leaving that to the observer to determine, or in being very specific about what those gestures might be. And how to interpret gesture across a corpus of literature would be an interesting question as well. Physical gesture, for example,
Absolutely. It would be really fascinating. And I think that there's a key difference as well between prefatory remarks that a playwright makes in setting the scene, and then stage directions that relate to specific movements that the characters make. And so someone like Beckett is extremely precise, and to the extent of being controlling about what he wants characters doing on stage. And then other playwrights just give you the dialogue, they just, just say these words, however you feel like, wherever you happen to want to stand, or, in relation to the other characters on the stage. So that there's, it could be a way of, a first step could be that this would provide a way of understanding ratios, ratios of stage direction to script, like to actual dialogue, ratio of playwrights' notes to stage directions, like on stage directions, a ratio of what is seen by the audience to what is seen by the director and the actors, because the two groups encounter very different things. The people in the audience, they hear the words, that's what they encounter, the words that are spoken, but the directors and the actors have access to a whole other set of vocabulary and information that the audience won't hear or see. They'll maybe perceive it as manifested according to the interpretations of the director and the actor.
Right. Yeah. There's another thing I wanted to mention. I think a lot when I just taught directing this semester, and I had my students read a variety of plays of different styles, different approaches, some of them more spectacular, some of them more like character driven, et cetera. The interesting thing about Project Gutenberg is Project Gutenberg inevitably does flatten out the structure of the play as the playwright puts it on the page, right?
Yeah.
Even though it then gives you the ability to analyze it, it's in that, just to recognize that that's not an unfiltered resource. That's a resource that has already gone through a filter.
Yes.
So that's, I'm just to be conscious of that.
But
But your point about how a speech is characterized, that's such an important thing in how a drama is perceived, that I think is, if you think about the history of stage directions, either providing putting a certain gloss on a speech, that becomes a very interesting challenge, because it's not just the words, it's how they're said, it's in what context they're said, it's the physical position of the actor saying them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of information there.
There's a lot of information, and what that says is that there's no single answer. There's no right question to ask. There are only multiple questions that you choose between. And so in this version, we counted fairly straightforward things, as you saw on that spreadsheet. Whereas in another version, you could look at page layout, like you could train it to the algorithm to recognize line breaks as opposed to sentence breaks. And you could think about patterning across a corpus. And that would be a really interesting question to answer. You can basically train it to recognize whatever you want. It's just a matter of thinking about how and then why, or why first maybe, and then how. But the idea that a play would perform as a visual artifact, that Yeats would say, arrange the lines of the Hawk's Well on the page in a beautiful manner that evokes poetry, is something that the audience at that play, they're not going to see, but maybe they'll hear it. And it also is something interesting about what is happening to drama at that moment. Why, like just to see where it's happening, first of all, would be very informative, and help maybe lead, suggest, or answers. Well, make available the information according to which to speculate on why it is happening when it does.
And readers, it also, Hawk's Well is an example, or many other plays, where a lot is left to the reader and the director's imagination, right? How you take those Yeats speeches in Hawk's Well and move them to the stage is something the playwright is not telling you. So there's that space between the drama on the page and the theater and the production on the stage. That is just a space to be aware of, and an interesting one to explore. I wanted to bring up one thing that came to me when I was looking at this original data that Catherine showed me. Was it's very interesting to look at numbers of speeches per character, but it struck me, and we've talked about this, that one of the things, if one were interested in how women have been represented on stage across this corpus, you would have to tag those characters in advance as men or women, or figure out a way, or however they identified with gender, or figure out a way to teach a computer to do that, because it's not always in the opening list of characters what the gender is. Sometimes it's in the pronouns that are used, and sometimes it's just assumed that we'll recognize that as a female name,
Yeah.
Estragon, Vladimir, Pozzo, and Lucky could be anybody, right?
Yeah.
And then, but for Beckett, they had to be men. That was one of his prescriptions, even though he doesn't call them that except when they refer to each other with pronouns. So, but then you could really discover how women have been characterized over the course of history in numbers of speeches, in monologues, and so on. And then the question that raises for me is, how do you tell the difference between a character of a woman that is demeaned by the playwright and a character of a woman that is celebrated by the playwright? How do you discover empowerment? That may not be something the computer can do, but it certainly comes, because having a lot of lines doesn't necessarily mean that that gender is being valorized by the writer, right?
So this is where I should mention David Bauman, and we're really indebted to him. He's professor in the computer science department who developed the text generator for us and organized the computational analysis of the corpus. And so with Kent Chang, a grad student. And so David co-authored an essay with Ted Underwood and Sabrina Lee on gender in the novel. And so they looked at over 100,000 novels and found ways of, so they were looking to train an algorithm to predict gender based on words associated with characters. And what they found over the course of looking at the novel was that initially it was very easy to predict the gender of a character based on the verbs and the adjectives associated with that character. However, over time, it became far less easy to predict that individual characters were much more gender fluid in how they were represented in these novels. And that was interesting. And then what they also found is that there were far fewer female characters over time, even in texts written by women. And so all this to say that it is possible to identify gender and using various either verbs, vocabulary associated with characters, or just pronouns that feature. It's usually not necessary to go in and assign gender to characters. But there's also very interesting questions related to what you just brought up about what roles, men or women or people of indeterminate gender or, different genders play in different. Thank you, Gabrielle. Gabrielle, so this is one of the students in the class. She just put up the reference to David's essay there in the chat. Thanks so much, Gabrielle. So this is, I think, a very interesting question to bring to Irish drama. The presence, the predominance, the role of female characters, and say especially in something like Yeats's Kathleen Ní Houlihan, where you have two very different mothers. You have the mother of this family, that are really striving to kind of better themselves and through this marriage, and then Kathleen Ní Houlihan, who is a kind of spiritual, symbolic mother of Ireland, and the very different kind of languages that are associated with them. That would be something I think that in particular would be interesting to look at.
Definitely.
Yeah.
How much time do you want to allow for questions, Catherine?
Some, but what I wanted, definitely, let's allow, I don't know, let's move into questions just in a minute. First, I just want to show a couple of clips from class and from the students' final assignments. So this was a really interesting, there were really interesting responses to this assignment, which asked them to combine lines generated by the text generator, lines from the plays on the syllabus, and lines of their own composing, both lines of dialogue and stage directions, whatever, and to create a new play using these three different forms. So I'm just going to show you a clip from Lucia Salazar's play, and she's reading it aloud in class on Zoom. So this class happened on Zoom, which in a way really worked for this, although it would have been great to be able to perform these, in 3D as opposed to on the flat screen. And so I'll just show, I'll share my screen, and then maybe Lucia can talk a little bit about what she was doing in this play. Okay, so let me share my screen again. Okay.
Well, it was all over quickly. Hyper. She wants.
Can you hear? Can you hear it? Yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to throw you right into the middle of it, okay? And what you'll see is that the original lines are just normal looking, with Lucia's composition. The text generated are yellow, I think, and the lines from Place on the Syllabus are highlighted in green.
To keep me here, stuck forever. Estragon. We are not clergymen. Hyper. Perhaps not. Nothing more, nothing less. Pause. Hyper. My mother wants to know what you thought of her. Estragon. She is one lovely specimen of an affectionate woman. Hyper laughing. I don't know what you mean, but it's best that way. Estragon. I'm a barbarian in this place because I'm not understood by anyone. Hyper. What's that from? Estragon. Some play or something Greek maybe. I don't know. Estragon. Everything all right now? Hyper. Yeah, she won't be mad long. Estragon. Who? Hyper. What do you mean who? Eily. Estragon. You could have met your mother. Hyper. No, my mom's not upset. Hyper. Estragon. Suppose Eily is serious. What if I don't get married tomorrow? Estragon. You're really confusing me. You said you were going to America. Hyper. Yeah, but I didn't mean it. Is it my fault people take things so literally? Pause.
Okay, so you get a sense there of what is of the kind of complex and really fascinating, dramatic environment, let's just say, that Lucia created. Lucia, would you like to say something about what you were doing there?
Yeah, so I used the text generator that we've been using in class, and I generated on lines from Waiting for Godot and the Colleen Bawn, and observed the sons of Ulster marching towards the song. And so that's why the characters' names are those names, because the text generator picked them up and then kind of like scrambled the language and then used those characters' names. And it kind of wrote itself using the text generator, which was really strange. And the play itself is kind of strange, which kind of works because the plays we've been talking about in class, especially like the 20th century plays, language is used in a really strange way, especially like Waiting for Godot, when language isn't really used as a mode of communication, but it kind of it shows us something else, like something more emotional. And that's what's happening in this play. And so a lot of the lines from the text generator really worked when we're talking about the ideas of memory and rehearsing language and forgetting and kind of miscommunication. So in this clip that was just shown, the characters kind of ask each other questions about what they were just saying. And that's kind of what happens in Waiting for Godot. Like the characters are talking to each other, but they're not quite understanding what they're saying. And that's what we have in this play. And a lot of the things that the text generator picked up on was the idea of like being stuck in Ireland, which is what a lot of the characters in the plays we've looked at, especially in the 20th century, picked up on and talked about. And so the text generator was really great in picking that up. And then I just filled in like different sentences from different plays. And it kind of made sense, which was really cool.
And I think one of the fascinating lines is, why does everyone take what I'm saying so literally? And it's it's so brilliant because we do that all the time. That's what we do. And yet these are words, so that there was something great about all of these assignments, and that they really brought up again the idea of the problem of language, words as things that we produce all the time, that we rely on, that we exchange with one another, and that are actually just words. And so they're obviously highly meaningful in terms of their literary context, their historical context, their content, but there's a kind of borrowedness actually that runs right through the syllabus. And I just want to show you a quick this quotation from from Joyce, that I think in a way underpins this course. This is from Portrait of an Artist. How different are the words home, Christ, ale, master, on his lips and on mine. I cannot speak or write these words without unrest of spirit. his language, the Englishman, so foreign and so familiar, will always be for me an acquired speech. I have not made or accepted its words. So this is Stephen Dedalus complaining about being a native speaker of a language that has been recently thrust on Ireland. So, you know, the population of Ireland, the majority spoke Irish until the middle of the 19th century. And then en masse, the population shifted due to the trauma of the famine and the need for survival into English. And so English is a recent language for Ireland at the time that Joyce is writing, even for Irish people now. And so to labor in this native language is a very strange paradox. And one, I think, that leads to a heightened sense of the strangeness of language in Irish drama, and a heightened sense of the kind of performance that speaking is, and the kind of, in a sense that is perhaps artificial, but also serious and motivated, passionate, resentful, creative, and, you know, ultimately with Joyce, kind of appropriative. You know, he really takes hold of the English language and really makes it his own, famously. Yeah.
Can I ask one question of either Lucia or Gabrielle? But Lucia, you were talking about the experience of creating this play. What did you take from that experience that was unexpected? In other words, what did you learn from the process of this text generator about the dramas you were studying, about the plays that it drew from, about any of that? You know, what did that expose for you that might not have otherwise been accessible? Do you see what I'm interested in?
Yeah. So one of the lines that the text generator generated was, "It's only a short distance of a half a mile you see me going." And then another one of the lines was, "Why should you be talking Irish when it's past?" So there's this idea of like stasis and like not moving forward. And something that like you pick up when you're reading these plays, but once it's like brought to you in this generated form and you're like, oh, it keeps talking about characters wanting to escape or characters not being able to move more than a half a mile, you kind of can understand the plays in that way, and as in Ireland, or how characters think of Ireland in that way. So that's those are like that's the thing that really stood out for me.
Interesting. Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Gabrielle, would you like to say something about your play and what you were doing, and like describe the scenario that you created?
Sure, yeah. So the scenario of the play that I wrote, it's titled Cass, and so Cass is the name of the central character who is unable to stop revisiting old conversations with his family members who are gone from his life. And so it's a majority of text-generated language, and I sort of manipulated the syntax and other parts of it so that the format, I guess, of the play is 5 scenes in which he's alone speaking on the phone to members of his family. And so it's suggested in the strangeness of the language created by the text generator that he's sort of slowly unraveling. And so there are those lines mixed in with the lines that I've written, and also 3 lines from Anne Devlin's After Easter. And so I started composing the play because the assignment was to sort of make a response, or to kind of figure the representation of Irishness across the plays that we read on our syllabus. And so I started with the ideas that I found really interesting among those plays, which was sort of a very specific relationship to place and to space as well, in sort of understanding and stabilizing an identity as an Irish person, or as a member of a family, or as a member of just like a society that's changing right throughout the syllabus. And so there's a lot of that going on in my play as well. The main character sort of bounces around the environment, but he's only sort of tangentially relating to his environment and the space. And so there's also a sense that he, as the only character that appears on stage, and as the only character who is assumed to be left alive, there's a sense that he's sort of almost ghostly, I guess, wandering, almost like Piper in Observe the Suns, which Lucia just mentioned. So yeah, that's sort of what was on my mind. And to also answer the earlier question of how the text generated lines influenced the making of the play, I think in terms of like getting a sense of the syntax across the plays, it was very interesting because a lot of the lines that were generated were sort of ridiculous and they didn't necessarily make sense. And I feel like a lot of that has to do with the way that syntax from centuries ago it's taken in the same pool of information as the more recently written plays and the syntax of like more modern language. And so I feel like the meshing of those two creates like a very eerie feeling that I also found useful in making my play.
Yeah. I mean, the plays were great in suggesting a kind of echo chamber or in exploring the echo chamber. And sometimes Irish literature can seem like an echo chamber. And, you know, Gabrielle's play was really about family as a place where, you know, you are to a large extent trapped. You know, you're born into it, you don't have control over who's in it. You are kind of processing what's been said to you over and over. It was set in a supermarket, which made so much sense. This character listening to recordings of voicemails on the phone, trying to come to terms with them. It was, I mean, both these plays were just really great. And what was amazing was how creatively Lucia and Gabrielle responded to both the prompt and also the kind of the lines produced by the text generator. And so this, I think, kind of opens on to a big question about what this could mean for playwriting. And, you know, the question came up when we were talking, Peter, about, you know, is this a new mode of theater and I think that there is something about the evolution of drama as it, you know, folds in new kind of social forms. And this, I think, bringing in AI generated lines both kind of calls on a higher level of creativity, but it also becomes very suggestive in a kind of Rorschach blot kind of way, you know, that, you know, verbal mishmash can suddenly reveal itself to actually be highly meaningful, given the right kind of way of looking at it. But also it draws on the audience in a different way. Like, it's a very, very interesting experience to listen to these plays and think about, try to discern what is written, you know, what's original, what's borrowed, and what's generated. And I think that this is something, you know, theater is a place where we understand our relation to one another, or we understand how people understood their relationships to one another in the past. And so this kind of very active listening that's trying to kind of discern between these different, you know, kinds of discourse is a very interesting practice to engage in collectively, right at the moment when so much of our culture is about to be infiltrated by AI generated language. And, you know, what is it that we count as human? Like, I know that can be a very hackneyed question, but what do we count as meaningful language is maybe another way of approaching this. What do we see as meaningful? And because in some ways, bad writing is merely reproduced, you know, excessively routinized speech. And we're trying to create new forms that can actually express our experience right now. So I think it opens up possibilities. So maybe we should turn to questions. So I don't know if there's questions in the chat. I see there's loads coming in. So Peter, do you want to direct our attention to what particular questions in the chat?
There have been a lot going back and forth. Let's see. Well, one question that was interesting is language on class, socio and economic class. Is that something that could be explored through this? In other words, here's the question. Could this same technique be used for socioeconomic class, which is less binary or clear-cut as gender, right? Certainly in the history of Irish drama, yeah. How different classes were represented on stage has been a very important and dynamic issue across time, even up to the present, right? Yeah. So that was one question that was posed.
Yeah, it's a great question. And, you know, some of these questions, yeah, so this issue, I think, relates to things that literary critics have been thinking about for a long time. And say someone who famously does this is Mikhail Bakhtin, talking about register and linking particular ways of speaking to particular class positions, particular professional positions. So whatever walk of life you have, whatever stratum of society you come from, you have a particular language. And that language has its vocabulary, it has its syntax. And so what you could do is train an algorithm to classify those, to find within, say, a particular context, to look for sets of terms, sets of features that are related to particular social contexts. So this would be a very, very interesting way, I think, of searching for the representation of different voices.
Yeah, and the challenge, it seems to me, also is that that language changes over time, which is why I think taking a decade, for example, and limiting your search to a decade would, or a particular time frame, might be more revealing, because those keywords, and from the sense of Bakhtin as well, will change over time.
Absolutely. And also, just one more thing, that what Bakhtin tells us very convincingly is that these different registers can often mingle within the one person. So, you speak in a way that you've learned, that you've inherited, that you've just absorbed. And so searching for these clusters would actually show us hybrid people. And I think that would be really interesting. People who defy, sort of very simple categories. And then that opens up questions about those characters, who are they? What is their narrative that they became like that? Or how can this playwright generate this kind of complex character?
We just have another minute, but there's one final question, which it goes back to something you said earlier. You mentioned the analysis of novels. What might we be able to find in plays that we might not necessarily be able to find in novels, or vice versa? In other words, does that analysis function equally well in both? Or are there things that drama might reveal that the novel might not, and vice versa?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's much simpler to apply these methods to novels. They're chunks of text, like that's all that, chapters, paragraphs, sentences. Whereas plays have, all kinds of things that we've been talking about: stage directions, character names, prefaces, sometimes essays following them, all kinds of things. And so it's slightly more challenging to apply these tools to drama. However, I think that suggests that they could say much more about drama. I mean, okay, they can say a lot about the novel too, but I think that where it might become very interesting is about relationality, about what characters relate to what characters, when, how often, who is marginalized. And so, characters in novels can speak to one another, and you can measure that. Obviously, they do all the time. But in a play, that becomes particularly salient, the actual relationships on the stage.
Yeah, and just to finally add that novels are written to be read, plays are written to be performed. So there's a step past the reading of the play, which is its final and complete realization. So they're literary objects, but they're also theatrical objects. So that's just another factor there. Fascinating.
Yes, subscribe to Irish Studies mailing list for more news and announcements.
Thank you, Julia, for that.
Thank you everybody for joining, and thanks for the great questions. So I hope that this will be an ongoing conversation, and it's really interesting to hear these comments and feedback. And thanks to everybody for joining us. Thank
you so much. And I, Catherine, you're not going to get away with not having more conversations about this. So we'll enjoy that. Thanks everybody so much.